What is rhetoric? Let's all say that word aloud. Rhetoric. Rhetoric. Go on, say it. Rhetoric. We might mispronounce it as rhetoric, but it's actually pronounced rhetoric. So there we are. We're learning already. But what is rhetoric? So we know how to pronounce it, but what is it? Rhetoric. So when we hear the word rhetoric used in conversation, it often has a negative connotation. This is especially true when used in the context of politics. However, rhetoric is a very nuanced and dynamic concept with many applications. So in just day-to-day life and in conversation, just how we might hear this word used, rhetoric, it's often used in a negative sense. Usually it's used as a way to criticize. Oh, so-and-so's rhetoric was inflammatory. So-and-so's rhetoric was divisive. Their rhetoric was angry. You know, it has that negative connotation. But in actuality, rhetoric it's not positive or negative. It just depends on how it's used, right? It's actually a very dynamic term. So we want to try to understand what this word truly means so that we have a better sense of that. So let's look at an extended definition from CSU SD's Rhetoric and Writing Department. So they define it as rhetoric refers to the study and uses of written, spoken, and visual language. It investigates how language is used to organize and maintain social groups, construct meanings and identities, coordinate behavior, mediate power, produce change, and create knowledge. And they go on to say, rhetoricians often assume that language is constitutive. We shape and are shaped by language. Dialogic, it exists in the shared territory between self and other. Closely connected to thought, mental activity as inner speech, and integrated with social, cultural, and economic practices. Rhetorical study and written literacy are understood to be essential to civic, professional, and academic life. So let's break this down a little bit. So rhetoricians are people who study rhetoric. Now, what these different terms mean, constitutive. So if something is constitutive in this sense, they say we shape and are shaped by language. And what that means is how we speak and what sorts of words we might use, characters, these different things that are a part of how we speak, those shape our identities. Right? So the way that we view ourselves often are intertwined with how we communicate with members of that same cultural group or other members of different cultural groups, whatever it might be. But language is something that shapes us and shapes the world around us. How we speak about things kind of determines what those things are. Dialogic, and they define it as it exists in the shared territory between self and other. What that means is, if we look at the word dialogic, we might be familiar with the word dialogue, right? So a dialogue is an exchange of ideas between two or more people, right? So in this sense, if something is dialogic, it exists in the shared territory between self and other. So language depends on we need multiple participants in order for a language to work, right? If there's only one person in the entire world who speaks one language, a certain language, but nobody else ever either has or will speak that language, is it truly a language? That's an interesting thing to think about. But when we think about language just in an everyday sense, it depends on others for it to work, right? So I'm communicating, so I'm a person who's communicating ideas to you all as an audience, right? And you all communicate ideas to other people. So language exists in community. We need other people to speak and read a language in order for it to be considered a language, if that makes sense. And so rhetoric is a part of that. Closely connected to thought. So this kind of gets to what I was saying earlier about if there's only ever one person who speaks or understands a language and there's nobody else ever in the world to understand that language, is it truly a language? That's an interesting idea. But when we think about language, we think in language. Just kind of sit there with yourself right now and imagine your thoughts. You're speaking to yourself in your head, right? We need language. Now, obviously, when we're thinking, there's a mixture of sounds and images and abstract concepts and all sorts of things that go on in our mental space. However, when we're kind of going through our day-to-day lives and we're just thinking to ourselves, we are talking to ourselves, right? We're using language in that way. And so that means that our thoughts need language in order to be fully realized, which is a really interesting idea to think about. And then when they say that language is integrated with social, cultural, and economic practices, all of these things kind of make up the workings of society. The workings of society depend on communicating ideas. They depend on language for these things to kind of work. So it's a really interesting idea. Now that's a really complex definition of rhetoric. Let's look at a more simplified definition here. So we have a couple of key concepts. Now these concepts are going to be very important for our understanding of these ideas for this course. So we need to define these a little bit. So here's a more simplified definition of rhetoric. The means or methods by which an argument or message is conveyed. In other words, how a message is delivered. So the way in which a message is delivered or conveyed to another audience or to an audience member is the realm of rhetoric. So one analogy that we can use, so rhetoric is the vehicle that contains the message. It gets the message across. So when we think about vehicles, first thing that might pop into your mind is a car, right? So a car is what we call a vehicle. But the word vehicle, just on a vocabulary level, is just a container that transports things or contains things. So in this sense, rhetoric is a vehicle that contains or transports a message. Now, think of it this way too. The way that we convey messages, they might be different according to our audiences, and they might be different according to the intent that we're trying to get across or the message that we're trying to get across. And so you can kind of think, to extend this analogy further with the car example, there are different kinds of cars, and these different kinds of cars signify or signal different kinds of messages, right? A sports car is going to send a different message than an SUV or a tiny smart car or a big truck or something along those lines, right? Each of these vehicles have different messages that they kind of transport, they signify, right? So rhetoric is the same. It's a vehicle that transports a message. Now, text. This is another key concept, another word that we're going to use quite a bit this semester. Now, we're probably most familiar with the word being used to describe written words. So what's on the screen here is a bunch of text, and that's where our term text message comes from, right? It's a message that is sent to your phone, but it's in written words, written language. And so we use it in that way. So yes, text means written words, written language, but that's not the only definition of the term. So really a text is anything that can be analyzed. Okay, so in other words, it's anything with a meaning or a message. So if we are studying something, so studying an object or studying an essay or studying a book or studying any number of things, whatever that thing is that we are studying then becomes a text. When it is the object of analysis, it becomes a text. Okay, so an example would be, if we were in a classroom, I would hold up a marker right now and I would say, this marker is considered a text if I'm trying to understand the way that it was designed, the shape, the colors involved, how it works. If I'm trying to understand that object, by virtue of it being an object of study, meaning something that I'm analyzing, it then becomes a text. So in that way, anything in the conceivable cosmos, whether that's an object like a material object or even an abstract concept like an idea, if it is being studied in order to understand it on a deeper level, then that thing becomes a text. So I want us to start using that word in that expanded understanding of it. It doesn't mean just words on a page or words on a screen. It is anything that we are studying to try to understand on a deeper level. Okay, so anything has the potential to become a text. Now, the third concept here, we need to understand this word on a deeper level. And this is our textbook, Everything's an Argument. This is how Lunsford and Riskovich, the two authors of our book, this is how they're defining this word. Argument, it's a perspective, a position, an opinion, a point of view, a claim, or a message. Now, we often in conversation use the term argument to mean the surrounding conflict that might result from a given perspective. So we might say, oh, they're having an argument. And that means that these two people or two or more people are disagreeing about something, and they might be angry with one another, and there's conflict involved. Now, in conversation, that's fine to use argument to mean that thing. But if that's how we're only thinking of argument, we're going to miss out on a lot of we're going to miss out on the complexity of that term, right? So argument is really any kind of opinion. So I'll give you an example. My argument about pineapple on pizza is that it's delicious. So that's my opinion. That's my argument, my expression and my point of view of that particular topic. Now, somebody might disagree with me. They might be like, no way, pineapple on pizza is disgusting. And so there might be that disagreement, but the disagreement itself or the conflict itself is not the argument. The argument is the opinion that's being disagreed about, if that makes sense. So we want to understand that term in a broader sense. Argument is merely an expression of opinion, okay? It doesn't mean the surrounding conflict that might result from a disagreement, if that makes sense. So, when we think of rhetoric, text, argument in these terms, we can begin to look around us and we can understand that we can read physical spaces on a rhetorical level. So, physical spaces, such as classrooms, can be analyzed rhetorically. The way a building is constructed sends a message. Courthouses and government buildings, for example, are often designed in a classical style in order to send a message of authority, respect, and seriousness. The ways classrooms are arranged also send messages. So I have here a couple of images from some key government buildings in the United States. So we have the Supreme Court building here. Then we have the Capitol building where Congress is. And then down here is the White House. But you notice that these three buildings are very similar in their design, right? They have a lot of commonalities. All three of them have these columns. They kind of have, these two have the same sort of jutting sort of facade in the middle, and actually the Capitol building does as well. But you notice that these buildings, because they're designed in this way, which is, looking at ancient Roman and ancient Greek architecture, that's the model for these, right? What they're doing is they're using that force and weight of history. Wow, these enduring, philosophical ideas of democracy and government and authority, all of these things, they're imbued in these buildings, right? The way that they're designed. Just by looking at these buildings, they're sending that message by virtue of their design. Now, if the government building were just designed like a nondescript kind of office building, if you were just walking by and you weren't aware that it was a government building just because it was this kind of bland, nondescript building, that wouldn't send that same message of authority and seriousness and, all of those things that come along with what we associate with government, or whatever the case might be. So that's something to keep in mind, but that is a rhetorical choice on the people who designed these buildings. like I said, they didn't just choose to design them as kind of simple nondescript buildings. No, they designed them in these classical styles so that they would send this message of grandeur and authority, right? But all of that is a rhetorical choice. So, classrooms can send a message as well, just by virtue of how they're laid out. So here is an image of a classroom, kind of a standard looking classroom, right? So at the front of the room, we have a blackboard here, or maybe it's a smart board, and then there's a projector screen, a little podium action going on here. And then we have these desks all arranged in neat rows, and they're all facing the same direction. Now, when you walk into this classroom, what message does the way that it's arranged send to anybody walking into the classroom? So just think about that. You walk into a classroom and it looks like this. Automatically, what are the messages that we're receiving about what we should do when we're in this room? Think about it for a moment. So these desks, they're all facing toward the front of the room, right? And they're all arranged in neat rows. And so when we walk into this room, we don't really have to think about what we're supposed to do. We know that we're going to sit in one of these desks and we're going to face forward. So the way that these desks are arranged are sending the signal that whatever's happening at the front of the room deserves our attention, right? So our attention should be up here. So in a classroom, usually the teacher, the professor is at the front of the room, right? And so the way that these desks are arranged are sending that signal that we should give that professor or that teacher our attention and usually our respect and whatever it might be, right? But all of that is sent to us just by virtue of how the classroom is arranged. So that's a rhetorical choice. Now look at a classroom like this. So if we were to walk into this classroom, we see all these chairs arranged in a circle, right? So we know that now, just by virtue of how these chairs are arranged, that the attention actually doesn't need to be on only one person, but rather everybody is deserving of that attention, right? So we know that we're going to sit in this circle, and we can assume that means that we're all going to discuss, and that there's not going to be only one person that's going to be the focal point. There's going to be a lot of focal points. And so this is sending that message that everybody is an equal participant in this particular arrangement, right? So that is a rhetorical choice. It sends that message just by virtue of how it's done, right? So just as physical spaces can be read rhetorically, style of dress or clothing style is also something that we can read on a rhetorical level. The way we dress ourselves can also be read rhetorically. Think about the message you send to the world, either consciously or unconsciously, by your clothing choices. The brands we wear, the colors we choose, the style of clothing we adopt. These all send a message about ourselves to the world. So look at what you're wearing right now. Now, depending on the time of day and where you are, it's going to change, right? It's going to be different. But look at your style of dress. Now, you may not have thought consciously when you dressed yourself. Maybe you weren't thinking too much about it. You were just kind of doing these things. But when you look at somebody in a certain style of dress or wearing certain clothes, that sends the message, or sends a message, or actually many messages usually, but there are messages being sent by the way that that person is dressed, right? So if somebody's in shorts and a t-shirt, that is sending a more perhaps casual message to the world, right? People might interpret that as, oh, this person is, they want to be interpreted in that casual sense. Whereas if you're wearing a shirt, a button-up shirt with a tie, right, that sends a different message. And so we want to think also about the context, right? Context, or the surrounding situation, determines how we dress ourselves. Now, in the morning when we're going to school or going to work, there are a lot of sort of unconscious choices that we make or unconscious things that we might not necessarily think about on that conscious level, but we're going through it, right? So the weather determines our clothing choices, where we're going determines our clothing choices, who we're going to be with determines our clothing choices. Any number of factors kind of contribute to that rhetorical message that we might be sending. So what are some different situations or contexts we might find ourselves in that would influence how we choose to dress ourselves? Just kind of think about that for yourself. What are a couple of different situations that you might be in that would change your clothing choices? So I mentioned, if we're going to work or school, just depending on, perhaps our relationship with school or work and what it is that we do for work and where it is that we're going for school, all of those different things will determine this, but we're going to dress a certain way, right? We're going to choose specific things for that specific context. So another example is thinking about like a job interview. So if you are dressing yourself for a job interview, the choices you make are going to be very different than if you're going over to your best friend's house to watch movies and kind of chill out on a Friday evening, right? That is going to be very different than showing up to a job interview. It might be appropriate to show up to your friend's house in pajamas or sweatpants or something really casual like that. That's okay. That context warrants that, and that's the message that you want to send. But if you were to show up to that job interview in those pajamas or those sweatpants, that would send that message to those people that you don't value their time, you don't value that position, and you're not sending the message that you take this seriously, right? So that determines your clothing choices with the message that you might want to send. Just like the logos on our t-shirts or if we're wearing a specific baseball cap with a particular baseball team on it, right? Those are sending messages to the world. So this is an English course. So obviously we're going to focus on rhetoric and its relation to writing and language. The way we write and speak is also very much rhetorical. How we convey a message depends on what it is and for whom it is intended. For example, the way we speak to our grandmother is going to be different from the way we speak to our best friend. How we get the message across is rhetoric. So remember, rhetoric is the vehicle that transports the message. So is that vehicle going to be a fancy sports car, or is it going to be a more practical kind of SUV, right? That just depends on what the message is that you're trying to get across and how you want it to be understood. So this example, speaking to our grandmother, we might say certain kinds of things or speak in a certain kind of way if we're communicating a message to our grandmother. But if we're communicating that same message to our best friend, we're probably going to speak very differently with our best friend than we would with our grandmother, right? Because the audiences are different, and we want to make sure that the message is going to be understood in a particular way based on the expectations of that audience. So all of that stuff, how we communicate, is very much the realm of rhetoric. And so that's what we're really going to be delving into this semester. So look around you, look at your space, whether that's your home or in your office or your community. All of these different spaces, these different clothing styles, all of these different messages are conveyed on a rhetorical level. Now, we may not really think about it on a conscious level, and typically we don't. However, but once we begin to really look at that stuff, we can see that all of these different things are sending messages on a constant basis.